Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Meet the Author, brought to you by the Institute for Global Transformation. We are a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization, and our vision is a world working together to utilize the power, love, and wisdom of higher consciousness to benefit humanity and the planet. And our mission is to support transformations in consciousness and the way humanity interacts with one another so as to bring about positive change in the world individually and collectively. We invite you to visit us at our new website, which is www.theglobaltransformation.org. And there you'll find great resources in a beautiful new layout. And there's also a join button at the top if you'd like to become a member of our Changemakers community. And there's a donate button as well if you'd like to support our efforts, including programs like this. Tonight's program is being recorded, but it's a little different. And we did send an announcement out, but unfortunately, the person who was supposed to be with us tonight as our guest, Dr. Yvonne Kason, fell victim to modern technology problems and does not have internet service now. So unfortunately, she won't be able to join us tonight, but we have offered this opportunity for those who wanted to attend and those who would like to watch this later on YouTube, that we would have a discussion on the topic and cover at least some of the highlights of the book that I was going to review with Dr. Kason, and then we're working with her to schedule her for another month that we can have her back, and very much look forward to that. So I thank everyone who's joined us live this evening. And for those of you who are watching this later on YouTube, I assure you this will be an interesting discussion, and hope that you'll tune back in when we do have the honor of Dr. Kason joining us at a later date. Speaking of our YouTube channel, we ask that you do please subscribe and to press that little bell icon next to the subscribe button so you're notified when we do post new content. That's a very convenient feature, and we appreciate all of the support that you give us through YouTube and your subscription. So with that, I'm not going to read Dr. Kason's bio as I normally would in under the typical scenario, because I want to save that for when she is our guest. But I thought what I could do is talk a little bit about the book. I was going to do a little version of a PSA about the book for those interested in this topic. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then talk a little bit, but it's going to be an open discussion for those who are here tonight to ask whatever questions you want, or bring up any thoughts, comments about this topic, which is spiritually transformative experiences. This is a term that Dr. Kason herself coined, and it's designed to provide kind of a large umbrella to cover a whole host of different types of experiences that people have that have the common effect of causing some type of spiritual transformation. Sometimes we refer to that as an awakening. So we can get into what those various types of transformation experiences are, as well as some of the common features of each of those phenomena. So before I do that, though, I want to say a couple of things about the book and SCEs. I wouldn't be here were it not for my own SCE. I have had the experience, and on the whole, I would say very positive and life-changing, but not always so, with one of the forms of an SCE that's talked about in great length and detail in the book, that has to do with something called Kundalini energy. And if you're not familiar with that, hopefully after tonight, you'll be a little bit more familiar. This book, which is titled Touched by the Light, Exploring Spiritually Transformative Experiences, I think the book is outstanding. I think it's the best source that I've found yet that talks about a large constellation of factors and related information that address different aspects of spiritually transformative experiences. A lot of the similar books, in my experience at least, tend to describe things that are pretty unusual, and they usually have a lot of anecdotes sprinkled through there. And in some respects, a lot of these books end up on the bestseller lists. Many of them, most familiar, are probably on the topic of near-death experiences or something in that realm. And I think they sell so well and get so much attention in part because there's an entertainment aspect to them. And in some fields or areas, this could be referred to as glamour. And I don't mean to put any of those books down. I think they're all well worth reading, at least the ones I have. They've also been very helpful to me in my experience on the path. But this book covers not only what STEs are, but then has great background on the Eastern teachings and philosophies that are well related to these and have been documenting spiritually transformative experiences for thousands of years. The West is much newer to understanding these as a larger societal, cultural aspect. So the book goes into a great deal of detail about the likely explanations for these experiences as at least been documented for, again, thousands of years by many sources in the East. Dr. Kason is an MD. She devoted her medical practice to dealing with and providing therapy and assistance to people that have had these experiences, because you would see in the book, if and when you read it, that this is not always, it's not the easy ride that some people, when they say, oh, sure, I'd love to be enlightened, because they think it's just perpetual bliss and all their problems will go away and it's wonderful. And this is simply not the way that genuine spiritual transformation happens. So she discusses also research that's been done to try to bridge the Eastern understandings and wisdom and teaching with Western scientific empirical research that has been done starting in the last century, probably now for at least 50 years. Dr. Kason herself has been practicing in this area for at least 40 years and has also personally had 5 different near-death experiences. And she goes into detail in the book about those and the different types of NDEs, as well as Kundalini awakenings. There are many chapters that talk about what happens after you have one of these experiences, and the physical, the emotional, the psychological effects. These experiences can have tremendous impact on all aspects of our lives. They can be very disturbing to existing relationships, employment. So it is anything but all unicorns and rainbows, as they say. And the book is just a beautiful resource that could frankly be used, I think, as a text and teach a whole course on this as a great introduction. But for anyone that is curious about these or has had these experiences, and I say this both to our live audience and anyone who may watch later, I encourage you to have this available as a resource, because if you run into questions, it really can help with that. And one of the general experiences that a lot of us have had after having an STE is wondering what the heck's going on, and if you're going crazy. And they can really be very confounding and confusing and disturbing. And so to have a resource like this to understand that these are well recognized, they're well researched, they're well documented, and there are other resources available to help you with this, I think that can be a great service. So the last thing I'll say before we kind of get into the meat of the discussion is that a good part of the reason IFGT exists is to serve as a community for people that have had spiritually transformative experiences. And so we invite you to join our community. You'll find a welcoming and safe space here so that there are other people you can talk to. And 2 years ago, Dr. Kason co-founded an organization called Spiritual Awakenings International. And if you just go to spiritualawakeningsinternational.org, you'll find their material. And I would encourage you to check that out if you're looking for another community. They held their second annual online conference a few weeks ago, and I thought it was outstanding. And one other person in our audience tonight attended part of that with me, and I think she also thought it was well worth the while. So I encourage you to check out those resources. So with that, I'm going to take a breath and see if there are any questions that people want to kind of lead off with. You can unmute yourselves, and I'll try to answer them, or we can see what other people's thoughts and experiences are. Just kind of curious, for those of you who are on camera, how many of you think you have had an STE? You got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and those are the people on camera. So everybody that's on camera at least raise their hand. So it's not surprising, because I think part of the reason you're here and part of the reason that you would be drawn to IFGT as well. So would anybody like to start with a question, or I can go into a little bit more of what is in the book if not?
I was just wondering, Ken, if you could, I think we all probably think of like near-death experiences, but can you give other examples of what she talked about as an STE?
Sure can. So in her, or SAI's definition of an STE, these are the general categories that she includes. So mystical experiences, and can probably get into more detail on what those are. She combines terms and uses the term spiritual energy / Kundalini episodes, near-death experiences, death watch experiences and after-death communications, psychic experiences, and inspired creativity and genius. So those are the main categories. You want to go into that some more, or does that kind of answer the question?
No, I think that's very helpful.
One of the things also, well, one of the key things that really caught my attention is there's a great discussion in the book that explores the theory that there is a high correlation between Kundalini energy and all of the STEs. And there's no settled data yet as to cause and effect, but the research that has been done, which is by Dr. Kason's admission preliminary, but there do seem to be some indications in the data that there at least are some correlations in the numbers of people that report having some Kundalini spiritual energy experience, as well as some other type of STE as included in the categories I just reviewed. I will describe maybe a little bit more about what the different categories entail as to best that I can remember. So mystical experiences would be where you might have an idea, or I'm sorry, an experience of being in contact with other, what may be referred to as subtle entities, which covers a pretty broad range. There may be just other types of mystical experiences that don't involve beings. And if you want, I can open the chapter and get into more detail, but I will do that if there are questions. Again, spiritual energy, Kundalini. Kundalini is an Eastern term that refers to a coiled energy that is thought to be dormant at the base of the spine, and actually in the sacral region. And then at some point, for some people, this energy can be awakened or aroused, and it then goes to other places in the body and has a whole laundry list of effects. And again, having had personal experience with this, I can describe some of my experience with that more, or you can look up in the book and see kind of the range of experiences that these types of energies are related to. Near-death experiences. Last month, we interviewed Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry, and Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experiences. Another thing I really like about Dr. Kason's book is that she appropriately recognized all of the other researchers that I'm familiar with, at least, and many others that I've heard at least reference to. And she certainly acknowledged that Dr. Moody coined the term near-death experiences and helped pioneer that field of research. Death watch experiences are what is a term that Dr. Kason used, but she acknowledges in the book that these are also referred to as shared death experiences, which was the specific area of focus that Dr. Moody and Mr. Perry discussed last month. After-death communications are a wide variety of such phenomena that people have with folks who have left their physical incarnation and have the ability to somehow still communicate with us after they have transitioned. Psychic experiences, or what is also referred to these days as psi, these are the various different psychic abilities. Other references refer to these as cities, and these are some of the ones that we're probably fairly familiar with, but all the different clair types of experiences, clairaudience and clairvoyance, etc., those will be included, as well as several other types of psychic experiences. And then inspired creativity and genius are in part where people are either born with incredible talents and they tend to kind of come into this life in an awakened state. But there are many reports also of people that have sudden talents and creative abilities that they never had before. One thing to note is that, as I was kind of referencing earlier, Kundalini may correlate highly with having some of these other experiences. Certainly do for me. And that same is true with the relationship with some of these transformative experiences involving new creative talents. For instance, there are many reports of people that have had near-death experiences that then afterward suddenly are able to either write in ways they never had before, or play musical instruments, or have some other creative or artistic talent that they didn't have before. So that, in a very large nutshell, is what a little more detail on what STEs are. Any discussion, questions? Peggy.
I would share that I don't know whether this had any transformative experience to it, but I was finishing up a feng shui consultation in Reno one time, and I forget how this came about, but I had not dowsing rods, but the ones that make noise, the two-pronged rods. What do we call those?
I like a tuning fork. I don't know.
Tuning forks, thank you. That's the word I couldn't get. And so my client, and I forget how this came apart because it's been many years, but I rang the tuning fork at the base of her spine, and she said the Kundalini just shot right up. So that was interesting.
That is interesting. You provide a nice example of there are a whole variety of ways that Kundalini energy can be aroused. I don't know that I would say that anybody can grab a tuning fork and all of a sudden they're going to get that energy. And I'll say something else about that in a moment. But you said, Peggy, you weren't sure if this was a transformative experience. You'd have to ask your friend.
And not a friend. That was,
okay.
I have no follow-up on it. I don't know. I just know what happened at the time.
Because we're all different, the experiences surrounding these phenomena and the patterns that people have after they've had these experiences are going to vary in as many ways as there are individuals. So there is a section in the book that describes, I believe it's 5 general patterns of what happens to people after they've had at least one STE that Dr. Kason observed through her years of medical practice and counseling for her patients. So whether this person you're talking about, Peggy, had a transformative experience after having that experience with the energy, we don't know. There are patterns where it could be just, it happened and then the after effects are so subtle they wouldn't know them, or the mind would kind of take over and say, no, that didn't really happen, I'm imagining things. Those are very familiar patterns, but they also could have been very radically changed by that one experience. That does remind me, one thing that is documented very nicely and clearly in this book is that there's a lot of misinformation about Kundalini energy, and some people think that it has some ties to very dangerous things, maybe even dark entities or something evil, and other people think that if they can just crank this stuff up, they're golden. And I would encourage everyone to gain their own knowledge through books like Touched by the Light, learn a little bit more about what the thousands of years of Eastern documentation have to say about this energy and what the more modern Western experience and research is with this. One thing that Dr. Kason says in the book that I couldn't agree with more is that this is not something to be toyed with. This isn't just a gag game to play with your friends or to dabble with, not because it is dangerous, but because it is powerful. And I don't say that lightly or in terms of magic. I can just tell you from my personal experience, it had significant physical, psychological, and emotional effects. And those have been life-altering for me, and they continue to evolve. And so I think it's something to be treated as sacred and respected. And I would just encourage that. But thanks for sharing, Peggy. That's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, I'm curious. The topic around after death, I forget exactly what the words used were, but I'm curious if Dr. Kason spoke at all in her book about dream visitations.
I'm almost certain that there were references to that. I'm hesitating a little bit because some other information that I was exposed to very recently was talking about dreams. So I'm trying to make sure I've got the right source here, but it certainly can be part of the after effect, and certainly one means of receiving after death communications or mystic experiences would be through dreams. Absolutely.
I'd like to hear other people's stories.
Anyone else cares to share? I understand that can be uncomfortable. We still have a lot of odd reaction to these things in the West, although I think those walls are coming down. I have made a personal decision to be more open about my experience in hopes that that will normalize these a bit and make them less weird and woo-woo, and encourage other people to do the same if you're comfortable doing that.
So are you saying that you have to have one of these experiences to have gone through the awakening, or is that just one of the ways that people go through enlightenment?
I would love to hear Dr. Kason's answer to that, but I would say the latter, Bibiana, that these are not the only routes to awakening whatsoever. It's just that this cluster of experiences that she has documented or written about share the common feature of leading to a spiritual transformation for many who have had the experience. One of the patterns that I was speaking about before is that, and I had this experience as well, you can shift patterns in your life. And one of the patterns is that you may have an STE and then nothing happens for a period of years, and you kind of go back to the life that you had. And so there may have been some degree of transformation, but it didn't launch you to some new level that all of a sudden there's just no going back. So it may be. And so I think the reverse is true, that people can certainly have an awakening without having to have an experience like this. I know people who have had other routes to awakening that were not included in this general typology.
I think a common one is some sort of trauma, right? Maybe death of a very close person or something. I don't think that would necessarily be considered an STE, right? But I've heard of people that things like that could trigger spiritual awakenings as well.
I agree. And therein also lies the possibility that these aren't like black and white, on or off types of things. And so one of the things that is explored in the book is the relationship with spiritual or Kundalini energy, and trauma is one of the recognized avenues for arousing that energy. And it may be that the energy is aroused at in such a way or at a level that isn't perceived by the individual, yet it is still a factor. And I don't believe there's ways of measuring that in Western science right now, but there is a possibility that trauma, like the loss of a loved one, could also have an interaction with that energy. And so technically it's an STE, but the transformational experience is what is most noted.
And maybe this is a topic for Yvonne, but I'm wondering, since she kind of relates these STEs to Kundalini, I wonder, is it the Kundalini energy that ultimately is causing the spiritual awakening, right? As that energy flows through us, is that what is actually causing that awakening? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think if I read the book correctly, she would say that's at least the hypothesis that she's been exploring. And the good presentation and discussion in some detail of what that energy is from the perspective of the Eastern documentation provides a potential roadmap that would explain that phenomenon that you just brought up, Michelle. So why is a near-death experience so transformative? Well, there's the kind of anecdotal aspect of it that you hear about and say, well, of course that's life-changing, because if you read some of these accounts, and if you go out of body or you have an interaction with a very recognized divine being, or you see loved ones in a beautiful field full of flowers of colors that don't exist on Earth, that would probably change the way you look at things and the way you go about the rest of your life. But part of her point as a physician scientist was to also look at this and say, yes, but what has actually happened to us that would cause our minds to think differently and to react differently? And that is where she draws these very cool, in my opinion, correlations between this energy. There's, I believe, was Gopi Krishna's work that she was talking about, that he postulated that this energy is a spiritual, psychological, and behavioral energy that changes. And I may have just botched those categories, but basically it was that this energy works in these three realms, and that is the causative ingredient that results in the psychological, emotional, and physical experiences that people often have after they've had that. So it's the presence of this actual energy that is related to that. One of the other things I wanted to share that may be interesting to others is, in my experience in trying to learn more and more about these things, just first of all trying to figure out what was going on, and then just as a matter of interest and continued journey on the path and awakening, has included that learning to discern what is just something I may have imagined and what may actually be real. And the one way that it has helped me is when I see the same ideas referenced across different sources that don't have any relationship to one another. And a lot of the material that Dr. Kason presents, I've seen in many other sources. So it was confirming, and it's kind of neat to see that from a Western medical practitioner that has also studied a lot of the Eastern traditions. So Bibiana shared that she was acknowledging or wanted to comment on trauma causing the awakening process. That's why she said, that's why I started on this path of seeking meaning to my life. So Peggy.
That sounds related to David Watkins' writing in his book, that pain which certainly can be associated with physical trauma, can be a means of raising one's vibrations.
I would agree. Is there more you can share with us about that?
Well, here's the question that I came up with to myself that I have not shared with anybody, but it was, okay, was the pain Jesus endured on the cross necessary for his enlightenment and ascension? I've never heard anybody ask that or address it, and I have no clue.
Well, don't know that we'll be able to answer the question, but I've actually heard kind of the opposite to that, in that he and very select other humans kind of came into that incarnation already highly awakened and ascended. And so
I've heard that too, that I've read that everybody's born enlightened. It's just, how does that show up, and do we acknowledge it, and do we consciously connect with the divine? What do we do with that basic beginning in our lives? I don't know. This is just stuff that floats around in my head on occasion.
I've kind of also heard the idea we all come in enlightened, but due to, being in this physical world and kind of the programs that begin at a very early age is where we lose that connection. Ultimately kind of going to sleep, if you would say it that way.
Yes, yes.
which is one of the pieces of information that you'll find in many different sources that are not related. That same idea. I think one of the common terms that's used is the veil, right? And so then the thickening and the thinning, and that as one idea or theory is that we're born and the veil is very thin, and then, as Michelle, you were saying, that through our childhood that tends to thicken up, and we might call that by different terms like conditioning or programming, but that's the process. And it's a process of kind of us forgetting our true selves, who we really are.
I'm curious, Ken, in light of all of that, if Dr. Kason touched at all on how that Kundalini energy manifests in physical reality. So basically, when we think of when we're children, that free-flowing energy of just joy and wonderment and awe in every single thing without any need for safety, conscious need. It's not as though we're walking around like, oh, I need to be secure in this. Oh, I need to not fear what I'm doing. It's just a complete free flow. And that awe and that wonderment, that pure joy, does she talk about Kundalini energy bringing that back into the adult experience?
I don't recall it worded exactly that way, but an element of a Kundalini or spiritual energy experience that is one of the ways that the people that have researched this identify that what someone reported may well be related to that energy would be states of bliss. And so I don't know if it's not exactly what you're talking about, but there is absolutely a recognized element that may be part of people's experience with this type of energy that does put them in a state of just peace and bliss and joy. And so I think that's a kind of yes, maybe, to your question. It's not that childlike just wonder and awe, but I think that could be related. From my own personal experience, I know that I've had that, where I just have had times where I just appreciate the absolute wonder of everything around, because I realize that for it all to be as it is something that we probably wouldn't be able to conduct our normal life and affairs if we were in that state constantly, because it's almost overwhelming. But when you have the opportunity to truly appreciate the wonder of it all, so to speak, it probably comes close to an adult version of what you're talking about. Yeah. Bibiana had entered something else in the chat. I'll read that. And then Peggy added a comment. So Peggy, if you want to share yours, or I can read that after Bibiana's. But Bibiana, again, had brought up the point about trauma and its relationship to awakening. And so she then shared, I came to a point where the pain was so unbearable that I chose not to take my life, and instead awake to find a way out of the pain. Would love to hear more about that if Bibiana has the chance. And Peggy, do you want to share your comment, or I can read it? So Peggy said, type this in the chat. I think my experience may have been similar to Bibiana. The pain led me to awaken one morning, knowing I was trying to take myself off the planet. A vision of my boys appeared, and there was so much love that I made the choice to stay. That's interesting. And Peggy, you might find it interesting if you were to get this book, because when Dr. Kason said that she had 5 near-death experiences, I was a little incredulous, and like, how does somebody have that bad luck to almost, die 5 times? What she goes on to do in the book is there's more depth and nuance to that term. And she, through her work, both in her medical practice and her research, has identified a number of different types of NDEs. And one of those is where you haven't even actually suffered a life-threatening trauma, but it's imminent. And I think she calls those imminent near-death experiences. So for instance, hers was, she had one of those where she was on a plane. It was almost guaranteed that it was going to crash. And so she had an out-of-body experience at that time. The plane recovered, and so she didn't have a full-blown near-death experience. So I'm wondering, do you think that did you have an out-of-body experience as part of what you had?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I've had some weird stuff, but not that one. That was more like a knowing that, oh, that's what I've been doing to myself, because I couldn't walk. And I thought, oh, I can't leave my sons. They just lost their father last year, and they love me so much. I just couldn't. I felt as though I was making the choice to stay, because I didn't know I was trying to leave until that moment. I woke up one morning and there it is. You're trying to leave. I'm going, huh?
And would you say that was a transformative experience?
Spiritually, not so much, although it certainly has me paying closer attention to nudges that I get from the universe, the divine guidance about stuff that I should do, and it seems, looking at how I've lived my life, it seems like I've been so stubborn, I have to wait until I'm hit by a 2x4 before I pay attention. So, I mean,
It sounds like it did produce some change in how you've lived or at least thought about your life. And the vision, I don't know if how tangible a vision you're talking about, but that could be a form of a mystical experience. And it doesn't matter. These labels are, I think, designed not to, that we have to put everything in its proper bucket and, you have to get at least 75% on the test to pass. I think it's more the idea that it gives a framework so that if something like this were to happen or has happened, you get an idea of, oh, these are recognized, these are known. And so certainly could be. That also may be a great example of how one size doesn't fit all. And so that could certainly be a mystical experience that you had. It wasn't the same as somebody that had Jesus stand right in front of him and tell him, something life-changing, but it's certainly could be a form of that. And I guess the interesting thing is that you and Bibiana are recognizing how pain and trauma can be triggers for some of these things. And I think it's important to know. It's interesting that, for better and worse, I guess, sometimes it is through substantial suffering like trauma that causes these shifts.
and where that takes me, Ken, in what I've learned is, if looking at everything, every experience we have, no matter how horrific it seems at the time, that it is for our ultimate good and that there is a blessing in that. One of the more interesting things I've been led to do is sit and write and ask, what is the blessing in X experience? And what comes out of that is amazing.
Yeah. And kind of in relation to that, perhaps, Bibiana offered, she said, I think anything that shakes your reality is an attempt to awakening. And I would agree with that. And the book also talks about a number of practices, including what you were sharing, Peggy, of writing, journaling, doing some form of creative expression. Certainly also presents the what are called the 8 yogic limbs, and that is a prescription or suggestion at the very least of things to do and not do to help yourself after you've had one of these experiences, and or to potentially induce, but under the caring guidance of a knowing, knowledgeable teacher. It's interesting to me also that in discussions like this can all seem very unusual, and indeed it can be. But two things. One, a lot of people have had these experiences. Our societies in the West discourage open discussion, but I've learned now that a lot of people are exposed to these types of experiences or know someone who has been, but we're just not encouraged to talk about them, and rather can be actively discouraged. So they're not that unusual. On the other hand, or I guess in addition to that, a lot of it is the language that we use. So if we talk about things that have special terms like STE, then it sounds like it's something very out of the ordinary. But if you talk very matter-of-factly about how, yeah, gee, after my son died, I just was never the same. Well, everybody can kind of understand that a close loss can change you. Now, it may be that, as we were talking about earlier, that is a form of trauma that may have a relationship to spiritual Kundalini energy, et cetera, and it may actually qualify also as one of these spiritually transformative experiences, but without those labels, we just recognize that something traumatic can cause people to change and grow and shift. And that, I think, is what's kind of important to pay attention to, is that we don't need to get lost in the vocabulary and the jargon per se. It's more important to recognize that this is part of the human condition and part of what largely we all experience in one way or another. I don't know of anybody that's gotten a totally free ride from birth to death without ever suffering. But good for you if you have, but or maybe not. Maybe you didn't grow too much. So one of the other areas that is talked about in the book, and again, maybe some of you tonight or those watching in the future may be familiar with these personally, but there is something that is referred to as spiritual emergence and something else referred to as spiritual emergencies. And there's discussion about these in a couple of chapters in this book. As I said before, having an experience that would fit under this large umbrella of the term spiritually transformative experience isn't just the path to bliss and enlightenment and has no downsides. And they can often be quite distressing in a variety of ways, which are discussed in very nice detail in the book. And for some, they can actually lead to crisis. And for some, they have been poorly misjudged and not recognized for what they are, and instead are assumed to be some form of mental health problem, like a psychotic break. And there are two very well-known researchers, Stan, and I believe his wife is Christina Groff. They helped to pioneer the recognition of spiritual emergencies. And another gentleman who was on the recent conference that SAI held, David Lukoff, he and another mental health professional, Francis Liu, led the efforts to work with the professional organization that is the source of what's known as the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the formal document, for those who may not be familiar with it, from which all recognized mental health diagnoses are stem from. They don't stem from there, but that is the official source. So if there is a known mental health diagnosis, it is in the DSM. And Drs. Lukoff and Liu led the effort to create a brand new entry in the DSM, some probably 20 years ago now, I believe, so that spiritual emergencies and spiritual awakening experiences are recognized distinctly in the DSM, so that they are not confused as some mental health problem. So that it was a huge leap forward for the professional mental health community to recognize and acknowledge that someone may present to them, and it may sound very unusual, but it is not a form of significant neuroses or psychoses. It is its own different set of issues, and therefore has different ways that it should be handled. There are tragic stories of people who have had a spiritual emergency, and they're put in psychiatric units, medicated, and it's the wrong treatment. And people have been institutionalized for significant periods of their life because people misinterpreted what was going on with them. So that's another great service that was done, and it's a great service for Dr. Kason to have included that in this rather comprehensive work. So thought I'd share that. There's a chapter talking about meditation. There's a chapter talking about psychospiritual healing and housekeeping. And so, as I've said now, and I think others of you have likewise commented, there are many changes that happen to us when you've had an experience or more than one. And there are some things that are highly advised that one does to help make that transformational experience less intolerable or make it tolerable, if not enjoyable. And so, again, can't emphasize enough how much I would encourage people to take a look at this book. If you've got any questions, or if you're just wondering about, should I be doing something different? Should I change my diet? Should I change my meditation practice? Should I sleep differently? Should I go to certain places or whatever? There's a lot of very good information. So
I'm just glad to see now such robust effort being put into communicating around these topics from such various perspectives and points of view. I remember, I think the most transformative experience that I recall, the first one that I had that really set the stage for the rest of where I've gone, is this experience probably about 2 years ago, where kind of out of the blue, I woke up one day and just felt very, very dissociated from, I guess, the way life had been. And by dissociated, I mean, if you've ever had a lucid dream where you're in your dream and you know you're dreaming, it doesn't feel like the same reality. Reality just feels so different. And that's kind of the feeling I had in my body when this happened, but it was this reality. And so that was very discombobulating. And at the time, there really weren't a lot of resources. There weren't really a lot of tools to help understand what was happening. And so it's just really nice to see that there are resources really growing, and people are putting a lot of effort into making those public. So just wanted to make that comment.
no, thanks for sharing. I couldn't agree more. I'm curious, what do you have any thoughts about kind of how you discovered the resources that you did, or any that you'd recommend?
Well, I would certainly recommend IFGT. This group is actually one of the very first resources that I found, which was really just through my own Google searching of trying to identify what it was, and also what answers I was looking for just came from divine guidance, so to speak. It just, without me knowing exactly what the questions were, the answers just started appearing. And I learned to trust that.
I think you would find a lot of very familiar information in this book, including familiarity with all of your experience that you just described, including the last part about just kind of the information finding you in a way. And it reminded me of another point that kind of underscores this idea of being very careful if anyone were inclined to say, yeah, I think I'm going to go try to, wake up this Kundalini stuff and see what happens, and take the fast track to enlightenment if that's the goal. There is a pretty well documented and understood notion that this energy awakens for each of us when it's our time. And that may happen through an event, or it may simply happen. It sounds like that may be part of what Samantha's experience was. It certainly is an apt description for me. I knew nothing about this, and it turns out to be a very common pattern. I decided to start meditating, had no idea what this stuff was, and things started happening. So it's not uncommon, but I didn't go seeking this and do anything to try to get this started. And I think if someone is inclined to do that, the strong advice from people like Dr. Kason, and also a person that I had a very wonderful opportunity to meet before she passed a few months ago, was Dr. Bonnie Greenwell, who co-founded something called the Kundalini Research Network. And Dr. Kason was an original member of that. And that is to work with folks that are familiar with this and let it happen if it's meant to happen, but don't push it. So I would look to this work and Bonnie Greenwell's work if you want to learn more about this and understand the phenomenon more. And it's something that, to your point, Samantha, it now is more widely recognized, and this isn't just the stuff of another culture that you can easily dismiss, or fringe people that are kind of get into this, but they don't have credentials that might satisfy more serious scientists and researchers. Again, both those people were terminally degreed and very studious in their work. So
yeah, actually, what Samantha was talking about how she just started Googling, and I think that I did that because when I was trying to, I guess, come out of the trauma and heal myself, like I had heard of people being able to heal themselves. That's when I started searching, like, well, what kinds of different things can I do to start that process? And one of them was when I learned about the law of vibration and how you can get yourself to a place where you're behaving and thinking in a certain way that raises your vibration and gets you aligned to your true self. And then I thought, well, that sounds like that's what I need to be doing, is getting myself to that higher vibration and not like rejecting the experience that I had or try to ignore it, because I think it's something that you have to like experience and go through the healing of that in order for your vibration to truly be aligned to who you really are. And that's how I started that process of like just trying to heal myself.
and I think you would find, if you were to read the chapter on psychospiritual healing or housekeeping, in this book, it would resonate with what you were just talking about, because there are things that you're going to end up having to do. You don't really have a choice if you've had any type of phenomenon like this or awakening experience and you're on the path. It's not going to be very pleasant until you do some of the things like Vivian, I'm sure you're familiar with and were at least alluding to in your comments. And it's good to have a reference like this book to see, oh, okay, well, here's some other things I can try. An example there's a lot of reference to grounding energy, and that's something that can be very useful to help with some of this, but also dealing with stuff from your past that you may have to deal with. And a common suggestion is to get appropriate psychological counseling, and that can be a huge part of moving your way forward. So
Yeah, because what I ended up doing was I put all of those I guess you can say like negative situations in my life, and I started putting them in a different perspective. I kind of started rewriting the meaning to those things, because as I learned that, all of those events in our lives occur for your expansion and for you to learn from, I started kind of like looking at them in a way of like, okay, what's the lesson here? What am I supposed to learn from this? And I just started like reframing the meanings that I had given it in the past, and trying to rewrite my story so that I don't, so I stopped telling the story of like, oh yes, this happened and I got a divorce, and you know what I mean? Like retelling that negativity over and over, and it just kind of like reinforces you to stay in this one vibration. And so that was kind of like part of the work that I did, was like just rewriting what that story was and rewriting the meaning that all of those things had in my life.
do you recall how you came to just make that shift in how you were viewing things, and got you to the realizations you just shared?
I think it's because I knew that doing that work was making me feel better. And so I just kept building on it, because I kind of learned to just kind of like, this feels good to me. I know that it's not easy to look at some of these things, but I would cry a lot of times while I was like writing in my journal, or just kind of thinking to myself of all those things that I didn't want to think about in the past. And I knew that that was that release that I needed, that I had been denying myself to feel.
But do you recall what prompted you to start doing that work?
Just through reading about how getting ourselves to that higher vibration is what we need to learn how to do through any situation that we are going through, and not letting those experiences define us, because they're there to help us grow and expand. So I think just reading about like the law of vibration, and how you attract who you're being at that moment. So I was like, well, if I want to attract more positive things, then I have to change the way that I'm showing up.
Thanks. That's great. It sounds like you may be describing, certainly, again, it's spoken to in this book. There's a term that I've run into in a variety of places called shadow work. A lot of the people in the spiritual or consciousness community will use that term to refer to things like you were just describing, that there are these things from our past, and some people even suggest they could be from previous lives, if that's part of your understanding and or beliefs, and they may be hanging out in your subconscious. But in order for you to make the kind of progress and growth that Bibiana was sharing, you got to bring those things out of the shadows and into the light. And in so doing, you face those things, you're going to have tears and probably some unpleasant experiences, but then they clear. And some of the description of spiritual and Kundalini energy is that it is kind of an accelerant for those things, that what might otherwise take many more years, or again, if this is something that you're familiar with, many lifetimes for those things to clear. This energy just kind of blows through and it forces those things to the surface. And that's why a lot of the experience that can follow the energy is a lot of emotional and psychological upset, because you're dealing with your stuff and it's not pleasant. But when it clears, then on the other side of that is just a substantially different life and existence. I'm here to tell you. So thanks for sharing that, Bibiana. And everybody for sharing. Again, I am grateful for you all for coming tonight. I'm sorry and apologize on Dr. Kason's behalf. Absolutely nothing that she was in any kind of control of. And I know she was upset that she wasn't able to join us, but I'm delighted I had the opportunity to read the book and attend the SAI conference, and look forward to when we do get to have her on and hear more directly from her. She's really just a delightful person, a wealth of experience and knowledge. So I doubt I've done it very much justice, but at least what our appetites perhaps. So Marianne, did you have something you want to say?
Yes, Ken, I just wanted to say thank you from all of us for an enlightening and formative, wonderful discussion tonight.
Thank you. Oh, it's really a pleasure. I think it's important. I, like Samantha, this was one of the first organizations I found that was a community to find and kind of begin to get some better handles on what was going on. And so I'm grateful, of course, to you and to the rest of the IFGT family. It truly is family, and great to have this as a home. So I hope this is helpful, and I hope to anyone who may be watching this later on YouTube that this is helpful to you as well, and encourage you to please consider getting this book and doing more research. We do live in an age where, unlike not very long ago, there is now perhaps even overwhelming information that's out there, but it's certainly available to you through all sorts of avenues. And so please don't feel alone. It can be a very frightening and upsetting and isolating experience. And part of what I hope we can do with programs like this is to let you know that there's no need to be isolated. We understand the fear and can help you with that, and invite you to come and join us here as well. So with that, if there's nothing else, thank you all so much again, and wish you a good evening and happy 4th of July.